The tea glass shattered on the marble floor, sending shards scattering across the rug. Colonel Dmitry Volkov didn't notice. He was entirely absorbed by the documents spread across his desk, papers that would vanish within the hour, secretly photographed by the quiet woman sweeping at his feet. Her name, at least to his wife, was Olga Kuznetsova. But her true identity was Helen Brennan, a ghost long before she ever set foot in Moscow. She had assumed this new life 18 months earlier in a cramped office in Langley, Virginia. Sitting across from a man who offered only a code name, Helen received a thin folder. Inside was a single photograph, a tall Soviet officer, graying at the temples, with eyes that seemed to pierce the camera rather than look through it. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, deputy director of the KGB's first chief directorate, was responsible for foreign intelligence operations across Western Europe. He knew every asset, every operation, every weakness in the Soviet intelligence apparatus abroad. The handler explained the stakes with cold precision. Volkov wasn't just another officer. He was a vault of secrets, and if the West could access even a fraction of what passed across his desk, Soviet intelligence would be set back years. But capture would be fatal. No exchange, no negotiation. Helen had 6 months to become someone entirely new. 6 months to speak Russian like a woman born in the Ural Mountains, to cook borscht like Volkov's grandmother, to move through rooms as if trained to serve powerful families. 6 months to bury Helen Brennan so completely that even she might forget who she really was. Training began in a hidden facility that didn't appear on maps, a place where Virginia countryside gave way to buildings designed to resemble Moscow apartments. Instructors barked in Russian until she dreamed in the language. She learned to make her bed the Soviet way, to stand with shoulders slightly hunched, to avert her eyes precisely when required. The facility included a room called the theater, a perfect replica of a Soviet apartment. Helen lived there for weeks, never speaking English, never breaking character. Instructors burst in at random hours, interrogating her in Russian, testing her ability to maintain the role of Olga Kuznetsova under pressure. A former Soviet defector taught her the final, most crucial skill, total immersion. You are not pretending, the woman instructed. You are Olga Kuznetsova, who happens to remember being someone else. One keeps you alive, the other gets you killed. Helen adopted the gestures, clothing, voice, and habits of Olga. She ate Russian food, listened to Russian radio, read Russian newspapers. By the time her training ended, she could maintain her cover under extreme duress, even while exhausted or inebriated. She had become Olga. Every movement, word, and thought aligned to her assumed identity. The flight to Moscow, via Helsinki, carried her deeper into her new life. Helen carried papers proving Olga's existence, a widow from Sedlovsk, husband dead in a factory accident, coming to Moscow, seeking work. She memorized every detail of Olga's life, the street, the factory, the husband's name. She knew this fabricated past better than her own childhood. Moscow in autumn 1959 was a gray, sprawling city. Helen arrived cautiously, navigating streets with a new woman's confidence. She found the address she had been given, a building for high-ranking party families, where neighbors reported everything, and entrance meant scrutiny. Irina Volkov, younger than her husband by 15 years and a former ballet dancer, would evaluate her. Helen had rehearsed every answer, every hesitation, every subtle expression. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Helen conveyed the exact blend of desperation and dignity required. Irina asked about experience, reasons for coming, and her husband's death. Helen responded flawlessly, adding tiny details to make lies believable. Irina seemed satisfied, explained duties, hours, and expectations. Helen would live in a small room off the kitchen, work 6 days a week, and maintain absolute discretion about everything she saw. 3 days later, Helen moved into the Volkov apartment with a single battered suitcase. The room was tiny but sufficient. She expressed the gratitude expected of Olga, though inside, Helen Brennan knew she was now living someone else's life completely. The first weeks were the most dangerous. Helen kept her head down, learning the rhythms of the household and the habits of its inhabitants. Colonel Volkov was rarely home during the day, but evenings changed the apartment's atmosphere. Irina grew more formal, measured in her words. Alexei, their teenage son, retreated to his room. Even the furniture seemed to straighten itself in the colonel's presence. He was not cruel, Helen observed, but authority clung to him like a second skin. She learned his habits with meticulous attention. Tea black with 2 sugars, precisely at 7 a.m. 3 newspapers at breakfast, Pravda first, then Vestier, then Red Star, with occasional pencil marks in the margins. She noted callers who prompted immediate departures and those who could wait. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he brought work home, spreading classified documents across his study desk, while Irina made excuses to keep Alexei away. Helen's training had prepared her for the technical challenges, but not the subtleties of human behavior. She noticed tremors in the colonel's hand as he handled certain documents. She watched him stand at the study window late at night, staring at Moscow's skyline, his face reflecting a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Occasionally, he spoke warmly on the phone to someone he called an old friend. Moments of humanity invisible to colleagues, yet impossible for Helen to ignore. She learned to work around these observations, capturing intelligence without detection. The camera she carried, disguised as a compact mirror, required moments alone in the study. Helen devised pretexts. A glass left on the desk, curtains needing straightening, a radiator knocking. Each excuse lasted just long enough, often a minute or 2, to photograph several pages. She memorized exact positions, noting even when the colonel had placed a hair across a file's edge, and returned each item precisely as found. The technical process demanded extreme precision. 1 page at a time, careful alignment, subtle lighting, a steady hand. Documents were sometimes 15 to 20 pages long. A full session could take 5 uninterrupted minutes, 5 minutes where any sound from the hallway could mean discovery and death. Helen developed a system of mental bookmarks, photographing critical pages first, always ready for interruption. She learned to read upside down and backward to reduce exposure, triaging documents by paper quality, classification stamps, and signature blocks, estimating importance on the fly. Film shipments were exchanged through her handler at a local farmer's market, each encounter carefully orchestrated. A paper bag of potatoes, innocuous yet vital, contained new film, sometimes brief coded messages confirming her work's value. Months became a year. Helen, now fully Olga, settled into a routine that felt almost normal. She cooked meals praised by Irina, cleaned rooms meticulously, and observed Alexei, quietly supporting him when criticized by his father. Dinner parties were crucial intelligence opportunities. The colonel and his wife hosted officials and their wives, vodka flowing, tongues loosening. Helen circulated unnoticed, committing discussions to memory. Over conversations about troubled assets in London, provocations in Berlin, and internal disagreements in Southeast Asia, she recorded every detail. Even when a visiting general described security protocols for a weapons facility, Helen stood nearby, a silent observer, absorbing every fact. She also collected subtle intelligence. She noted which colleagues visited for personal reasons versus professional business, which phone calls triggered tension or relief. All these observations were retained mentally. Written notes would be too dangerous. Helen created a system linking intelligence to objects in the apartment. A lamp held details about an operation in Vienna. A painting contained the names of 3 double agents, and a blue vase stored the schedule for a courier run to Prague. By the end of her first year, Helen had photographed intelligence on 12 Soviet operations, identified multiple intelligence officers, and facilitated the safe exfiltration of 2 Western assets who would otherwise have been captured. Messages from Langley confirmed her success and urged continued caution. The psychological toll was constant. Every interaction, every shadow, every unexpected sound was evaluated. One false move could unravel years of preparation. The The former British intelligence officer who had trained her had warned, it wasn't always mistakes that led to capture. Sometimes it was comfort, the belief that the role had become safe. Helen never allowed herself that comfort again. Helen's second year in the Volkov apartment brought subtle changes in the household that shifted the rhythm of her operations. Alexei graduated and left for university in Leningrad, taking with him the last remaining spark of lightness in the apartment. Irina grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours alone in her room. The colonel, sensing his wife's unhappiness, responded in the only way he knew, working longer hours, bringing home more classified documents, filling the silence with the shuffling of papers and scratch of a pen. For Helen, this meant greater access to intelligence, but also heightened risk. More work at home meant more opportunities to photograph documents, but also more eyes potentially observing her movements. Every step, every glance, every moment of seeming distraction could draw suspicion. She adapted her methods, varying her routines, and seeking new ways to access the study, the documents, and the conversation she was tasked with recording. Meetings with her handler became more sophisticated. Protocols were tightened. Exchanges at the farmer's market were occasionally replaced by dead drops. A loose brick in a park wall, a small package hidden under a bench, or even material left inside an innocuous grocery bag. Timing and discretion were critical. Too slow, and intelligence might be stale. Too fast, and a slip could compromise both parties. Helen's life became a delicate balance of operational urgency and near-constant vigilance. The risk was constant. One evening, Irina entered the study unexpectedly while Helen was photographing a document detailing Soviet missile placements in Cuba. Helen froze, slipping the camera back into her pocket and grabbing a feather duster just as Irina rounded the desk. A quick word of explanation, a gesture toward dust needing attention, and Irina left. Helen's legs shook as she steadied herself against the wall. The episode lasted seconds, but could have meant exposure and immediate danger. The colonel also occasionally returned home earlier than expected. Once, he discovered Helen standing at his desk, holding a pair of reading glasses he had forgotten. He studied her silently for a long moment before thanking her and taking the glasses. Helen left, convinced her cover had been blown, her heart hammering in her chest. Yet nothing followed. She realized either she had fooled him completely or he was quietly watching, testing her behavior. Helen's mental fortitude was tested daily. She learned to distinguish caution from paranoia, understanding that every shadow, every sound, and every unexpected movement could signal danger. Her mind cataloged the building's residents, analyzing potential surveillance, imagining photographs of her face circulating in KGB files. Her instructor's warnings rang true. Even those who made no mistakes could be caught simply by coincidence. Comfort, familiarity, and confidence could be deadly. Helen refused to let herself feel safe again. Her operational workload intensified. Every detail in the apartment became potential intelligence, which colleagues visited for personal reasons, which calls caused tension, which dinner conversations hinted at unreported operations. Helen remembered everything, committing it to mental archives rather than written notes. Lamps, paintings, vases, every object became a container for intelligence. By the end of her second year, Helen had disrupted numerous Soviet operations. The intelligence she captured identified key officers and thwarted potential threats. Every piece of information was transmitted discreetly through coded messages and film drops, ensuring Langley received a steady stream of actionable material without detection. But alongside the satisfaction of operational success came a growing psychological strain. She witnessed the Volkov's humanity, Irina's vulnerability, Alexei's insecurities, the colonel's fleeting moments of doubt. She was both an observer and a participant in a household she was simultaneously betraying and protecting. The line between Helen and Olga blurred. The more complete her disguise, the more she inhabited the role of someone entirely different. Yet every human interaction reminded her of the cost of that performance. The third year in Moscow was the hardest. Colonel Volkov grew increasingly cautious, implementing tighter security measures in his study and varying his routine, hinting at awareness of potential intelligence leaks. Helen could not tell if he suspected her specifically or if this was the paranoia that pervaded every level of the KGB. The constant uncertainty added weight to every decision, every movement, every second she spent in the apartment. The margins for error shrank. A single misstep could unravel years of work. Helen adapted, finding new ways to access documents and conversations while remaining invisible. The marked document incident, a paper she had photographed that appeared the next day with a small, deliberate mark, forced her to reevaluate her procedures. She began carrying a tiny magnifying glass hidden in her cleaning supplies, examining each document for signs of disturbance before photographing it. She learned to detect subtle differences in paper placement, microscopic shifts in dust patterns, and the faint variations in how documents settled on desks. Her efforts became more demanding, yet more critical. The colonel was being promoted, given access to more sensitive operations, and entrusted with secrets that fewer and fewer people were permitted to see. Helen now photographed contingency plans for nuclear deployments, strategic assessments of Soviet allies, and confidential analyses that revealed the inner workings of the Kremlin's decision-making versus its public posture. The intelligence she captured was increasingly valuable and increasingly dangerous to obtain. Every day was a delicate calculus. She memorized not only documents but patterns, which phone calls caused the colonel to leave in a hurry, which colleagues visited unexpectedly, and which conversations were innocuous versus revealing. She tracked routines, the placement of files, and subtle habits that could signal a trap. Each new security measure required adaptation, creativity, and unwavering focus. The intelligence itself was extraordinary. Dinner parties became a goldmine of operational details. Officials discussed assets in London, covert provocations in Berlin, and disagreements within intelligence bureaus across Southeast Asia. Helen memorized names, positions, and events, categorizing everything by importance. Even a visiting general, describing guard rotations and access protocols for a weapons facility, was unaware that Helen's quiet presence was recording every word. Yet her mission exacted a psychological toll. Helen observed the Volkovs' private lives intimately. Irina grew quieter, more withdrawn. Alexei, navigating school and adolescence, revealed vulnerabilities only Helen could see. The colonel, beneath the uniform and authority, displayed moments of warmth and doubt. Helen's role demanded she remain detached, yet the closer she observed, the more complicated her emotions became. She was both betrayer and protector, insider and servant, a shadow in a household where trust was given freely to someone who did not exist. The delicate balance between success and exposure never wavered. Every misstep could compromise operations, endanger lives, and trigger immediate consequences. Helen's life was a constant negotiation with fear, discipline, and a relentless pressure of performing as Olga Kuznetsova, a woman she had inhabited so completely that forgetting her true identity became an ever-present risk. Despite the tension, Helen found herself excelling in ways even her trainers had not predicted. Her ability to anticipate security patterns, memorize vast amounts of intelligence, and blend seamlessly into the Volkov household made her an invaluable asset. The intelligence she captured disrupted Soviet operations across Europe, identified officers and assets, and provided insights that influenced Western strategic decisions. Her work was meticulous, exhaustive, and life-threatening, but it was producing results that few in the West could even imagine. And yet, as the year progressed, Helen began to notice cracks in the Volkov household itself. Irina's increasing withdrawal and subtle reliance on Helen gave her even greater access, but also increased her visibility. The very success that kept her indispensable now made her more exposed. Each day, each meal, each casual conversation became part of a high-stakes dance where one wrong move could erase 4 years of painstaking work. Helen's training, her discipline, and her instincts would be tested to their absolute limits in the coming months. She was now not only an observer and recorder of intelligence, but also a silent architect of outcomes that could shift the balance of power across continents. Every decision carried weight, every glance held meaning, and every photograph brought her closer to the edge between life and exposure. As Helen entered the final months of her third year, the stakes grew higher than ever. Colonel Volkov's heightened security meant that the slightest misstep could end not just her mission, but her life. Locks were reinforced, study schedules were unpredictable, and visitors, both personal and professional, appeared without notice. Every routine she had perfected now demanded recalibration. Even minor details could become traps. Helen had to innovate. She began photographing documents under impossible constraints. Broad daylight when the colonel was in an adjacent room. Subtle movements while delivering food trays, even using shadows and reflections to capture classified information without direct exposure. Her small compact camera, disguised as a mirror, had never been pushed so far. She memorized exact angles, lighting conditions, and paper positions, ensuring she could restore every item exactly as it had been. Mistakes were unacceptable. Her mental cataloging had grown extraordinary. Lamps, paintings, vases, each object became a repository of information. She remembered which document sections were most valuable, which conversations hinted at undisclosed operations, and which guests were merely socializing versus providing intelligence. Her memory had become a vault, storing not just words and numbers, but patterns, gestures, and subtleties that only a woman living in the apartment daily could detect. The household itself changed subtly under her watch. Irina's nervousness intensified. Helen observed the pills she hid in the nightstand, the quiet moments of despair, the afternoon glasses of vodka that had become routine. Alexei's brief visits home from Leningrad revealed a young man uncertain of his place in a world dominated by secrets. The colonel, unaware of Helen's dual role, continued to display authority, tempered by rare glimpses of warmth toward his family. Helen absorbed everything. The more she watched, the more complex the mission became. She was not only gathering intelligence, but managing the fragility of the Volkov household in real time. Dinner parties were particularly invaluable. High-ranking officers and their wives gathered, discussing operations they assumed were secure. Helen circulated trays of zakouski, refilling glasses, appearing and disappearing with practiced invisibility. Every word she overheard, every gesture she memorized, became intelligence. The identities of covert agents, operational schedules, disagreements among bureaus, the slightest slip in protocol. Once, a visiting general casually described guard rotations at a weapons facility, oblivious to Helen's presence 3 feet away. Her memory captured every word, every nuance. Yet with every success, her risks increased. A marked document appeared after one of her photography sessions, clearly intended to test for tampering. Helen adapted quickly, scrutinizing each page for signs of disturbance, verifying dust patterns, and ensuring perfect replacement before anyone could notice. The colonel's routine continued to vary, making her mental calculations and timing more critical than ever. The psychological toll was relentless. Helen lived in constant tension, balancing fear and discipline with empathy and observation. She saw the Volkovs in their most human moments, Irina's vulnerability, Alexei's insecurities, the colonel's fleeting doubt. Every interaction reminded her of the duality she embodied. She was both betrayer and caretaker, observer and participant, a ghost in a household that trusted her completely. Despite these pressures, Helen excelled. She was more disciplined, sharper, and more aware than anyone could have anticipated. Her training, instincts, and meticulous preparation allowed her to operate at a level few could imagine. The intelligence she gathered was reshaping the West's understanding of Soviet operations across Europe, influencing decisions and preventing potential disasters. By the end of the year, Helen had not only preserved her cover, but elevated her effectiveness. She was the indispensable shadow in the Volkov household, invisible, omnipresent, and utterly trusted. Yet the paradox was clear. The very success that kept her alive also placed her under increasing scrutiny. Every day demanded a careful balance between access and exposure, risk and reward, observation and discretion. The fourth year brought new pressures and unforeseen complications. Irina's condition worsened. Her drinking increased, her nerves frayed, and Helen found herself taking on responsibilities that were normally the mistress of the house's domain. Meals, schedules, household decisions, and even the management of visitors increasingly fell under Helen's care. This gave her more legitimate access to spaces and conversations, but also made her more visible. The irony was not lost on her. Her greatest operational success, becoming indispensable, simultaneously increased the risk of discovery. Colonel Volkov, meanwhile, had grown more methodical and exacting. He varied his study hours, introduced more complex locks, and scrutinized every visitor. Helen noticed subtle patterns, a glance, a hesitation in speech, a sudden shift in routine. Each detail required her full attention. A single misstep could unravel 4 years of meticulous work. Helen's photography became increasingly daring. Documents that were once easy to capture now demanded careful planning. She would photograph files page by page in her room during the night, replacing them before dawn, memorizing content that included contingency plans, nuclear deployment protocols, and the identities of deep cover agents. Sometimes, the risk escalated to near impossible levels. One evening, a packet arrived with explicit instructions, operational plans for NATO targets, the culmination of years of Soviet preparation. Helen had to photograph the entire contents without alerting anyone, including the colonel, who had returned unexpectedly for a brief moment. Her mental discipline was extraordinary. She remembered not only the documents, but contextual details, which drawer held the copies, how light fell across the desk, the weight of the papers, the texture of the envelopes. Every object in the apartment became part of her memory palace. A lamp could store a series of operational schedules. A vase could hold names of deep cover agents. A painting above the sofa contained details of covert missions. Despite the immense stress, Helen observed the Volkov family with increasing clarity. She saw the colonel's rare moments of doubt, Irina's fragility, and Alexei's awkward attempts at independence. She found herself covering for Irina, hiding bottles of vodka, creating excuses for absences, maintaining appearances while simultaneously photographing the most sensitive intelligence. Her dual life, caretaker and spy, was a tightrope with no safety net. Dead drops and clandestine meetings became more complex. The farmers' market exchanges continued, but now they required careful timing and signals. Sometimes Helen left material in hidden bricks and walls, returned packages in crowded metro stations, or improvised new dead drop locations to avoid detection. Every movement was calculated, every encounter rehearsed, and every decision could be fatal. Yet, amidst the tension, Helen's skill and confidence had grown. She was no longer merely executing instructions. She was anticipating security measures, predicting patterns, and improvising under pressure. She had become an expert in both Soviet household dynamics and the inner workings of the KGB's intelligence operations. Her knowledge extended far beyond what any handler could teach, but the psychological burden weighed heavily. She had lived as Olga Kuznetsova for nearly 4 years, and the line between Helen and Olga blurred with every passing day. Dreams merged identities. Her memories intertwined with rehearsed lies. Even small gestures, once automatic, reminded her of the other life she was inhabiting. She was haunted by guilt, by the kindness she had shown to the Volkovs, and by the knowledge that her survival relied entirely on their ignorance. Despite these pressures, she continued. Each photograph, each overheard conversation, each detail memorized brought her closer to completing the mission. The intelligence she collected was unprecedented, the value immeasurable, and the risk ever-present. Helen had become both invisible and indispensable, a ghost in plain sight, holding the balance of life and death in the shadow war between East and West. By the fourth year's midpoint, Helen's operational tempo was relentless. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. The colonel had implemented new security measures, reinforced locks, unpredictable schedules, and more scrutiny of visitors and household routines. Helen's every move was calculated, rehearsed, and measured against the possibility of discovery. One wrong glance, one slight hesitation, could unravel 4 years of preparation. Irina's decline complicated matters further. Her drinking increased, and Helen often had to cover for her lapses, removing bottles, inventing excuses, and keeping guests unaware of the wife's instability. Alexei had grown distant, his own uncertainties mirrored by the tension in the apartment. The household was fragile, and Helen's dual role as spy and caretaker demanded constant vigilance. Dinner parties became both opportunity and peril. High-ranking officials and their wives gathered, speaking freely about operations, plans, and secrets they assumed remained confidential. Helen moved among them with practiced invisibility, trays in hand, observing every gesture and listening to every word. A passing remark could reveal the location of an agent or the timing of an operation. Once, a visiting general detailed the guard rotations at a weapons facility, entirely unaware that Helen was recording every word, storing it in her memory for later transmission. The technical precision required for her photography had reached its zenith. Documents were now larger, classified at higher levels, and occasionally left momentarily unattended in unexpected places. Helen had to improvise constantly, using shadows, reflections, and brief windows of opportunity to photograph pages without leaving evidence. Her compact camera, disguised as a mirror, captured images under impossible conditions, but she was the only one capable of executing it flawlessly. Helen's mental memory system had become extraordinary. Each object in the apartment, a lamp, a vase, a painting, held intelligence. The lamp stored schedules. The vase contained names of deep-cover agents. The painting recalled operational plans. Every detail of the colonel's office, the layout of the apartment, and the timing of the household's routines was meticulously cataloged. She was living a life entirely defined by observation, memory, and discretion. Yet for all her skill, the psychological toll intensified. Helen had inhabited Olga Kuznetsova's identity for nearly 4 years. The line between her real self and her assumed persona blurred. She sometimes woke speaking Russian, signing letters as Olga, or moving through the apartment with gestures that no longer felt rehearsed but instinctive. Her identity had been fractured, her emotions entwined with a family she had been sent to betray. A critical turning point arrived when a sealed packet arrived for the colonel one late November evening. Helen observed as he closed his study door, locking it, the weight of the packet clear in his careful handling. This was no ordinary document. It contained detailed plans for a major intelligence operation targeting NATO command structures. Deep cover agents, some in place for decades, were named. Their positions, access points, and timelines were specified. Helen knew that capturing this intelligence would be one of her most consequential achievements. She waited until the apartment was silent, moving through familiar shadows with the confidence of someone who had memorized every creak in the floor, every subtle sound. The lock on the study, which she had learned to pick years before, yielded under her practiced hands. The packet lay on the desk. She photographed the preliminary notes first, then carefully opened the sealed envelope. Page by page, she captured the contents, the agents' identities, mission parameters, and activation schedules. As she finished, she froze. Movement in the hallway, the shadow of a figure outside the study door. Heart pounding, she pressed the camera against her chest, hidden beneath her nightgown. The footsteps shifted and moved on. Helen exhaled, realizing it was Irina, returning from an unplanned trip to her room. 5 minutes later, she slipped back to her tiny quarters, hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through her veins. 3 days later, at their usual meeting at the farmer's market, she delivered the film to her handler. His grave expression told her that the intelligence was extraordinary. In return, she received a new package: film, instructions, and a small, unmarked pill, a reminder that the cost of capture would be lethal and that she had to be prepared for every eventuality. Helen knew then that the final months of her mission would test her to the absolute limits of skill, patience, and nerve. The culmination of 4 years' work, the intelligence she had gathered, and the lives she had indirectly saved all hinged on perfect execution in the shadow of constant danger. The 5th year in Moscow had begun, and with it came the heightened tension of an operation entering its final phase. Helen's position in the Volkov household had grown more delicate. Irina's decline persisted. She drank to dull the quiet despair of years spent with a man whose world revolved around secrets. Alexei had left for university in Leningrad, taking with him the household's last vestige of youthful lightness. The apartment now felt heavier, quieter, more oppressive, and Helen moved through it with the vigilance of someone who knew that one misstep could undo everything. The colonel had become increasingly cautious. Locks were upgraded, routines adjusted, and unexpected inspections of rooms or documents became frequent. Helen observed each change, calculating new strategies to maintain her access while avoiding suspicion. Even a seemingly insignificant alteration, the placement of a pencil, the angle of a file, required her acute attention. She had learned that intelligence work at this level was as much about psychology as it was about photography or memorization. Dead drops and meetings with her handler demanded constant improvisation. Instructions arrived in coded messages, packages disguised as vegetables or parcels, sometimes left in an unremarkable brick of a park wall or exchanged surreptitiously on a crowded metro platform. Every movement was rehearsed, every interaction a test of timing and nerve. Even minor errors could be fatal, yet Helen executed these exchanges with a calm precision that had become second nature. Her photography reached a level of artistry under extreme conditions. Documents of immense strategic importance, plans for NATO targets, deep cover agents, nuclear deployment protocols, required her to manipulate shadows, light, and angles to ensure perfect clarity while remaining invisible. She memorized each page, each signature, each classification mark, in case circumstances prevented immediate delivery to her handler. Yet the greatest challenge was psychological. Helen had lived as Olga Kuznetsova for nearly 5 years. The boundaries between identities had blurred completely. Dreams merged one life into the other, memories tangled. Even her reflexes, her gestures, her voice were now inseparable from Olga's. The isolation of espionage, the constant need for vigilance, and the intimacy of betrayal weighed heavily. She found herself acting with genuine care for the Volkovs, protecting them from their own fragility, even as she gathered intelligence to compromise them. One evening, a high-stakes operation presented itself. A packet containing directives for an imminent covert mission arrived in the colonel's study, heavily secured. Helen waited until the household was silent, moving through shadows with the skill she had honed over years. Picking the lock, photographing preliminary notes, and then the contents of the packet itself, she captured the identities, assignments, and timing of agents deployed across Western Europe. Each photograph represented a potential turning point in the Cold War. The tension reached its peak when footsteps echoed in the hallway. Helen froze, hiding the camera beneath her nightgown, heart racing, mind calculating escape and concealment. The figure passed. It was Irina, returning from her own errand. Helen exhaled slowly, silently chastising herself for the surge of panic. She knew that the margins for error had never been thinner. Days later, at the farmer's market, she delivered the film to her handler. The intelligence was extraordinary. It had the potential to shift operations and prevent loss of life. In return, she received instructions, new film, and a small pill, a precaution, a reminder of the deadly stakes. Helen understood that these final months would demand more skill, patience, and nerve than any previous year. Despite the ever-present danger, Helen took pride in her work. Her efforts had disrupted operations, saved agents, and provided the West with insights that could not have been obtained through other means. Each success was tempered by isolation, fear, and the intimate betrayal of a family that had trusted her completely. Yet she pressed on, knowing that her endurance, precision, and discretion had become indispensable. The fifth year was not only the most dangerous, but also the most revealing. Helen saw both the vulnerability and humanity of the Volkov household, and the intensity of her own transformation became undeniable. Olga Kuznetsova was no longer just a cover. She was a reality Helen inhabited as fully as her own identity. The line between the two was gone, and the consequences, both professional and personal, loomed larger than ever. The final months in Moscow were a delicate balance of opportunity and extreme danger. Helen, living as Olga, had become indispensable to the Volkov household, and with that indispensability came unprecedented access. Every evening, she navigated the apartment with the practiced invisibility of a ghost, aware that a single misstep could undo 4 years of work. The colonel's increasing caution, revised locks, varied schedules, and unexpected inspections made even routine movements a calculated risk. One late November evening marked a pivotal moment. A sealed packet arrived for the colonel, delivered with instructions for absolute privacy. Helen watched from the kitchen, noting every detail: the careful handling, the locked study door, the hush of anticipation in the household. The packet contained directives for a large-scale NATO-targeted operation, with deep cover agents deployed across Europe. Names, positions, and schedules were all meticulously documented. Helen knew that photographing this intelligence could alter the course of multiple ongoing operations and potentially save countless lives. She waited until the household was silent and shadows masked her movements. Picking the study lock, a skill honed over 4 years, she entered and began photographing. Every page, every note, every preliminary assessment was captured with precision. Her camera, disguised as a compact mirror, clicked softly in the darkness. Each photograph was a small victory, but also a heightened risk. Any sound, any misstep could have immediate consequences. Halfway through the process, a shadow moved outside the door. Helen froze, pressing the camera against her chest. Footsteps shifted, then receded. Irina, returning quietly from her room, had passed without suspicion. Helen exhaled, her heart still racing, and completed her task, resealing the packet exactly as it had arrived. The tension in those moments was suffocating, but Helen had learned to thrive under it. 3 days later, she delivered the film to her handler at their usual farmers market rendezvous. His grave expression told her everything. This intelligence was extraordinary. He handed her a new package: film, instructions, and a small, unmarked pill. She did not question its purpose. It was a reminder of the stakes, of the lethal consequences if she were ever captured. She hid it carefully, knowing that it might be her last resort. The months that followed were a blend of relentless work and quiet calculation. Helen photographed entire files over several nights, sometimes moving them into her small room to ensure thorough coverage, then returning them without a trace. She even accessed the colonel's personal safe once it was momentarily left open, capturing documents so sensitive they were stored separately from his regular files. Protocols for nuclear contingencies, lists of agents activated only in extreme scenarios, and strategic analyses of the Kremlin's internal decision-making all passed through her hands. Despite the escalating risk, Helen felt a growing sense of mastery. Her operational skills, perfected over 4 years, had reached their peak. Each photograph, each observation, each encoded message delivered was a testament to her precision and nerve. Yet, the psychological toll was immense. She had been living as Olga for nearly half a decade. Dreams blurred identities. Reflexes belonged to Olga as much as to Helen. Every interaction with the Volkovs carried dual significance: care for the family she observed and the intelligence she collected. The culmination of these years' work was imminent. The exfiltration plan, carefully orchestrated by her handlers in Langley, was scheduled. Diplomatic cover, timing, and secrecy had been meticulously arranged. Helen knew that the next phase, her extraction, would demand perfect execution, just as her years of espionage had required flawless skill, courage, and patience. As the days ticked down, Helen felt the dual weight of accomplishment and exhaustion. The intelligence she had gathered was unprecedented, her access unparalleled. Yet every step forward carried the reminder that one slip could undo everything. Her identity, her life, the lives of the Volkov family, all depended on her unerring precision in these final moments. The day of the exfiltration arrived quietly, without warning or fanfare. Helen moved through the apartment as Olga, performing her morning tasks with the practiced grace and invisibility that had defined her existence for nearly 5 years. Each action was precise, each word measured, yet beneath the calm exterior, her mind ran through the extraction plan repeatedly. Timing, routes, contingencies, every detail was memorized, every potential obstacle accounted for. Her handler had warned her, one mistake, one unexpected observer, could be fatal. The diplomatic cover arranged by Langley required the Volkov family to be absent for several days. During this window, Helen would disappear. New papers, a secure vehicle, and a carefully orchestrated route across the Finnish border had been prepared. She had less than 48 hours to complete her final tasks: photographing remaining documents, securing sensitive materials, and mentally cataloging every detail of the apartment and its inhabitants. Helen spent the morning in a quiet frenzy of careful diligence. Every document in the study was photographed, every cupboard checked for overlooked material, every conversation she had overheard cataloged in her memory. She rehearsed her departure, imagining the apartment empty, the streets clear, the vehicle waiting. She packed only what was essential: her identification as Olga Kaznetsova, the compact camera, and the few personal items she had allowed herself to retain over the years. By late afternoon, she was ready. The apartment was silent except for the faint sound of the colonel's footsteps in the study. Helen paused, watching him through the small crack of the kitchen doorway. Even now, he remained unaware of the scope of her work, the extent to which she had penetrated the most sensitive corners of his professional and personal life. The thought brought a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. She had betrayed the trust of a family she had come to understand, even care for, while achieving something that could alter the course of history. The handover with her handler occurred at the usual market, a nondescript transaction hidden beneath the appearance of ordinary shopping. A simple exchange of packages, polite greetings, and barely a word. Yet the weight of what she carried, the intelligence, the accumulated experience, the identity she had worn for years, pressed heavily on her. The final instructions were clear: drive, cross, and disappear. Every contingency had been accounted for, every potential trap anticipated. The journey to the Finnish border was tense. 18 hours of careful driving, every checkpoint observed, every guard's behavior noted. The border crossing itself was slow but uneventful. Helen's papers were flawless, her story airtight. For the first time in nearly 5 years, she felt a cautious relief, a glimpse of safety beyond the constant vigilance that had governed her life in Moscow. By sunrise, she was officially out of the Soviet Union, no longer Olga, no longer in immediate danger. The debriefing back in Langley was exhaustive. Analysts wanted every detail, every document, every observation cataloged and confirmed. Helen complied, recounting her years in the Volkov household with meticulous clarity, providing intelligence that would take months, even years, to fully process. Yet she withheld certain personal details: her dreams, her guilt, the photograph of the Volkov family she had secretly kept, a testament to the human lives entwined with her mission. Life after Moscow was a study in ordinariness. Helen assumed a new identity, married, and settled into suburban life. She chose the safety of routine, the small victories of domesticity, the quiet satisfaction of living in a world free from classified secrets. Yet the shadows of her years in Moscow lingered. Late at night, she sometimes stood at her kitchen window, remembering the weight of the camera in her pocket, the cadence of Russian voices through walls, and the life she had lived as Olga Kuznetsova. She had been a ghost, a spy, a woman who changed the course of the Cold War one photograph at a time. She had betrayed a family she had come to know intimately. Yet her work saved lives, disrupted Soviet operations, and provided insights that shaped Western intelligence for decades. In those quiet moments, Helen understood the paradox of her existence. The life she left behind was both real and illusory, and the cost of her success was measured not only in strategy and espionage, but in the fragments of herself she had left behind in Moscow. The Volkovs never knew. Helen's work remained classified for decades, only revealed in fragments over time. Yet in her own mind, the story of Olga Kuznetsova, the woman she had become to survive, to serve, and to succeed, would never be forgotten. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would whisper in Russian to the empty kitchen, "Is the tea ready?" Imagine living a lie so completely that even you start to forget who you really are. Helen Brennan, a young CIA operative from Ohio, did exactly that, spending 4 years undercover as a housekeeper in the home of a high-ranking KGB officer in Moscow during the height of the Cold War. Every day, she walked the line between life and death, serving a family that trusted her implicitly while secretly photographing classified documents that could topple entire Soviet operations. The tension, the secrecy, and the moral weight of her choices were unlike anything most of us can imagine. Could you have survived in her shoes? Could you have maintained perfect composure, remembering every detail, every habit, every secret, all while pretending to be someone else entirely? For Helen, the stakes were unimaginably high. One small slip could have meant capture, torture, or disappearance. Yet she learned to blend into the household flawlessly, speaking Russian with a perfect accent, cooking like a local, moving with the fluidity of someone who had always belonged there. She became Olga Kuznetsova, the quiet, efficient housekeeper, while in reality, every glance, every gesture, and every task was a calculated part of an intricate spy operation. She memorized the habits of her targets, the layout of the apartment, the subtle tells of the colonel, his wife, and even their teenage son. Over time, she knew them better than they knew themselves, all the while knowing that her survival depended on staying invisible, unremarkable, indispensable. Helen's story forces us to confront fascinating questions about human psychology and morality. How far would you go to protect lives that could be at stake without ever revealing your true identity? What does it mean to serve your country when that service requires betrayal of trust on a deeply personal level? And yet, even as Helen gathered intelligence that would disrupt dozens of Soviet operations and save countless lives, she grappled with guilt, empathy, and the strange intimacy of deception. She witnessed moments of vulnerability from those she was spying on, small gestures of love and care that she would never betray, but could never fully join. The story also challenges our understanding of heroism. Helen Brennan was not on the battlefield, nor did she wield weapons in a traditional sense. Her victories were silent, invisible, and measured in documents photographed, secrets extracted, and lives preserved. Yet these acts required courage, intellect, and nerves of steel, all in an environment where one wrong move could end everything. It's a story of perseverance, ingenuity, and psychological endurance that stretches the limits of what it means to be human in the shadows of history. If you think you know what a spy's life is like, think again. Helen's experience was one of extreme patience, meticulous observation, and constant adaptation. It was a life defined by vigilance, by small victories, and by the weight of living as someone else for years. The tension was never-ending. The risks were constant. The consequences, unimaginable. And yet, she emerged successful, forever changed, having impacted the course of history while remaining hidden in plain sight. So we ask you, our viewers, could you have lived such a lie? Could you have kept your wits under pressure, served people who trusted you implicitly, and done the work that no one would ever acknowledge publicly, knowing the stakes were so high? If this story fascinates you, if you want to uncover the hidden lives of spies who changed history in ways the world will never fully know, then subscribe now and join us as we explore more untold tales from the shadows of the Cold War. There are secrets waiting, stories that deserve to be told, and mysteries that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about history, loyalty, and courage. Want to uncover more hidden stories from the shadows of the Cold War? Subscribe now and step inside the lives of spies who risked everything for secrets the world was never meant to see.